Uh, Someone in your life is having a very specific experience right now, not a general or approximate experience. The specific and particular experience of someone who has been carrying a question in the interior and unasked form for long enough that the not asking has become more uncomfortable than the asking would be. In the specific and arriving form of someone who is about to ask what they have been not asking for the full period of the carrying, that has now exceeded the capacity to continue not asking without the asking happening. In the conversation that is coming, the question is the title of this reading: do you want me or not? In the full and direct and finally being asked form of something that has been wanting to be asked since long before the asking was possible in the specific circumstances of the situation between you. That made the asking difficult or risky or requiring more courage than was available in the period before the carrying exceeded the capacity to continue without the asking. That capacity has now been exceeded, and the asking is coming in the conversation that is about to change everything between you and this person who has been carrying the question and is now preparing to ask it in the full and serious and deep form that the title is describing as the conversation that changes everything. Welcome, my beautiful soul, and listen carefully to every word. Before the conversation and what it will contain and how to be in it. When it arrives in the full and serious and deep form of the everything changing exchange that this reading is about, I need to sit with you in the specific and honest form of someone who sees what you have been carrying. On your side of the question that is about to be asked, I feel the specific exhaustion of someone who has been living in the ambiguous middle of a situation that has not yet declared itself as one thing or the other in the clear and settled form of something that has been decided, rather than the unresolved and continuing form of something that is still in the deciding without the decision having been reached. In the specific and landed form, that would end the ambiguity and produce the settled feeling of someone who knows, rather than the unsettled feeling of someone who is still in the not yet knowing, that the ambiguous middle produces in the person living inside it. Whew. Ambiguity is its own specific form of exhaustion. I want to name that directly because it is one of the most invisible forms of exhaustion available to a person, in the specific sense that it does not look like exhaustion from the outside to the people observing the person inside it, because the person inside the ambiguity is not visibly suffering in the way that visible suffering announces itself to the people in the vicinity of the suffering, but is instead living in the specific and interior and largely invisible form of exhaustion. That comes from maintaining the not knowing. Without the relief of the knowing, that would end the maintaining and allow the resting, that the person inside the ambiguity has not been able to access, while the not knowing has been the primary interior experience of their daily life. In the situation that is about to produce the conversation that changes everything, you have been maintaining the not knowing in the specific and effortful form of someone who keeps the ambiguity from collapsing into the resignation. That would be easier than the maintaining of the not knowing, but that would end something that the person maintaining the not knowing is not yet ready to end, because the not knowing still contains the possibility of the knowing arriving in the form that the hoping is hoping for, rather than the resignation form of something that has been decided in the direction of the ending, rather than the direction of the arriving that the not knowing still contains, as long as the maintaining continues in the exhausting and invisible form of someone who keeps going rather than resigning, because the going still contains what the resignation would end. Spirit is showing me something specific about the person who is about to ask, do you want me or not? And I want to describe it in the specific and vivid form that makes this reading useful, rather than only generally reassuring. This person has been watching you in the careful and sustained form of someone who is trying to read an answer to their question from the behavior and presence and energy of the person they are watching, rather than from the direct asking of the question itself that would give them the answer in the direct and unmistakable form of someone who answers directly when asked directly, but that the watching was substituting for in the period before the watching became insufficient as a substitute. For the asking, it was replacing. They watched how you respond to them in the small and ordinary interactions that happen between two people who are in the ambiguous middle of a situation that has not yet declared itself as one thing or the other, for evidence of the answer to the question they were not yet asking directly, but that the watching was trying to answer from the indirect evidence of your behavior and presence and energy in those small and ordinary interactions. They tried reading your silences in the specific and effortful form of someone who is trying to interpret the meaning of a silence from someone who is capable of multiple different meanings of silence in the particular and frustrating form of a silence that could mean several different things simultaneously without distinguishing itself clearly as one meaning over the others for the person trying to read it. They tried reading your small gestures in the analyzing and overanalyzing form of someone who takes a small and ordinary gesture and subjects it to the full weight of the interpretive process in the hope that the gesture will yield the answer to the question, that the asking would yield more directly, but that the gesture reading was substituting for, in the indirect and insufficient form of interpretation that cannot fully replace the directness of the asking that is now arriving. Because the gesture reading and the silence reading have both been insufficient as substitutes for the asking. That is the only thing that will produce the answer in the direct and unmistakable form that the watching was trying to find without the asking, and they tried waiting in the maybe it will become clear on its own form of someone who believed that the ambiguity would eventually resolve itself into the clarity they were looking for, without the asking being necessary as the vehicle for the resolution through some organic and unhurried process of the situation finding its own clarity over time, rather than the asking producing the clarity in the direct and immediate form that the asking always produces when it happens, rather than being substituted for by the indirect alternatives that were tried first and found insufficient. Watching, reading silences, waiting, none of them produce the clarity, and the asking is now the only remaining option. For the person who has exhausted the alternatives and who is arriving at the conversation, that is about to change everything. With the do you want me or not, in the full and serious and deep form that the carrying past capacity has produced as the inevitable next movement of someone who has run out of the indirect alternatives to the direct asking. Now, what I want to say to you about how to be in this conversation when it arrives in the specific and everything changing form that it is approaching in, the conversation is going to require something of you that is different from what most conversations require of the person who is receiving a direct and serious and deep question from someone who has been carrying it for long enough that the carrying has built the specific pressure of something that needed to be asked. And that is finally being asked in the full and direct form of the everything changing conversation. It is going to require your full presence in the specific and non-managed form of someone who is completely in the conversation rather than partially in the conversation, and partially in the assessment of the conversation that the managing produces when someone is both in an exchange and simultaneously observing the exchange from the managed and slightly removed position. That produces the careful and considered response rather than the full and present response that the full presence produces when the managing is suspended for the duration of the exchange. Full presence in the do you want me or not conversation means answering from the honest place rather than the careful place in the specific distinction between the two that matters more in this conversation than in most others, because the person asking has been trying to read the careful place for the full period of the watching and reading silences and waiting, and has found it unreadable as the substitute for the honest place that only the full presence and the honest answer can provide in the conversation they are finally arriving at. After the alternatives to the arriving have all been exhausted, answer from the honest place, whatever the honest place contains for the specific person reading this right now, in the specific situation that this reading is about. Spirit is showing me something about the after. After the conversation happens, in the everything changing form that this reading is describing, and I want to tell you about the after, because the after is in many ways the most significant part of what is coming. For the specific person reading this, in the ambiguous middle of a situation that is about to produce the conversation that ends the ambiguity, the after of the conversation, regardless of which direction the honest answer takes it in, is the end of the ambiguous middle. In the settled and landed form of something that has been decided, rather than the unsettled and continuing form of something that is still deciding, in the exhausting and invisible form of the ambiguity that the conversation is about to end, and the ending of the ambiguity, in whatever direction the honest answer takes it, is a relief in the specific and physical form of something that has been maintained at considerable interior cost for the full period of the maintaining, and that is now allowed to resolve into the settled form of something that no longer requires maintaining, because the conversation has landed it in whatever direction the honest answer takes it in. The relief arrives in the body, in the specific and physical form of a tension that has been the background experience of the ambiguous middle releasing into the settled experience of the landed form of whatever the honest answer produces in the conversation that is coming within the next 72 hours. That spirit is pointing toward as the specific window for the conversation to arrive in after the carrying has exceeded the capacity that is producing the arriving of the everything changing exchange that this reading has been describing since the opening that began with the person who is about to ask rather than with you. 72 hours. And the ambiguous middle ends in the settled and landed form of whatever the honest answer produces. I want to speak to a voice that I feel very clearly in your energy right now, and that deserves to be addressed before the conversation arrives and before the voice speaks in the reactive and undermining form that it takes when it has not been addressed first. The voice says, "What if my honest answer ends something rather than beginning something in the direction I am hoping for? What if the everything changing changes everything in the direction of the ending rather than the beginning that the hoping was hoping for? When it was maintaining the ambiguous middle rather than resigning into the ending, that the resignation would have produced if it had arrived before the conversation. I hear that voice, and I am not going to tell it that the ending is not a possible direction for the honest answer to take, because it is a possible direction. And the voice that names it as possible is not catastrophizing, it is being honest about the full range of outcomes that the everything changing conversation could produce when the honest answer arrives in whatever direction it arrives in. But I want to say something about the ending as a direction that the voice is naming as possible, and that deserves the honest and direct response rather than the dismissive one that would tell the voice not to worry without the actual basis for the not worrying that would make the not worrying something other than comfort without grounding. The ending of the ambiguity in whatever direction the honest answer takes it is better than the continuation of the ambiguity in the exhausting and invisible form that the ambiguous middle has been taking for the full period of the maintaining that preceded this conversation, because knowing, even in the direction of the ending, allows the resting that the not knowing does not allow in the maintaining and exhausting form of someone who is keeping something alive, that the conversation will either confirm as alive or release into the resolved form of something that has been settled rather than maintained. Either direction is a form of rest after the maintaining, and the specific person reading this has earned the rest in the full and complete form of whatever the honest answer produces in the conversation that is arriving in the 72-hour window. That spirit is naming as the specific container for the everything changing exchange that ends the ambiguous middle. That has been the primary interior experience of the person reading this for the full period of the maintaining that is now ending. I want to give you something before I close this reading. In the permission form that the person in the ambiguous middle specifically needs before the 72 hours, and the conversation they contain, permission to answer honestly without shaping the honest answer into the form that is most likely to produce the direction you are hoping for, rather than the form that is most honestly what you actually feel and actually want and actually know in the deep and quiet interior of someone who has been in the ambiguous middle long enough to know what is actually there for them in the specific situation that this conversation is about to ask about, in the do you want me or not form of the question that has finally arrived at the asking answer honestly in the full and unshapen form of what you actually know. When you are in the deep and quiet interior of someone who has been maintaining the ambiguous middle, and who knows what they are maintaining it for, or whether they are maintaining it from something real, or from the habit of the maintaining that has become its own form of staying in the absence of the arriving clarity that the conversation is now about to produce. Whew. You are protected, and the ambiguous middle is ending. In the 72-hour form of the conversation that changes everything. For the specific person who has been maintaining the not knowing long enough to have earned the knowing that the honest conversation is about to deliver in whatever direction the honest answer takes it, which is the right direction. For the specific person who answers honestly, in the 72 hours that are already counting